So as we get started this morning, one of the things that I wanted to invite all of us to do is to take a minute. And then take a minute and just kind of think of someone that that you really admire. Someone who stands out to you as being really special. Because as we do that, though, I want to kind of qualify that a little bit. Because, so often when someone talks about someone being special, someone they admire, so often we think about people who are powerful politically, people who are powerful in business, people who are wealthy. So often you ask questions like that. In fact, I looked this up this weekend. If you look at the most admired people, the list includes things like Elon Musk, Taylor Swift, Bill Gates, Oprah Winfrey, right? All good people. But what if we qualified the list to say that I want to think of someone who's someone I admire because they are kind of a good person, right? That person who's just different, right? That person who seems to see life different than the rest of us, that they don't get caught up in the noise of life. Such as lawnmowers and dysfunctional equipment. They don't let people tell them what they're supposed to do, that somehow they're just distinctly their own people. But the people who are most amazing, I find, is that the people who are distinctly their own people, but at the same time care a great deal for other people. That somehow they seem to have this very independent sense about them, but at the same time a very caring sense about them. And they seem to love life and love people and enjoy their life, but enjoy caring for people. And I think that when we see people like that, it makes the rest of us want to be like them. Because I think that when we see that sort of thing, even though we live in a world, in a time where the opposite of that is celebrated, right? Right now we live in a time where, what matters more than anything is winning. It doesn't matter if what I do is right. As long as I win, it's justified. But even in a time like that, when we look around, when we see people who do not give in to that, that's what we admire most. And that's when I know personally, and I think for most of us, when we see someone live like that, we go, I wish I could live like that. And it's a key difference, right? When we look at someone who has power, we often think that I wish I could have that. But when we see people who are different and care for others, we wish we could be like that. And I think that's possible. I think that kind of life is in reach for all of us. But it doesn't happen accidentally. So I wanted to kick off a new series today, which is Follower. Now, that's probably kind of an odd name for a series, right? Because nobody wants to be a follower, right? What do we want to be? We want to be leaders. We want to be independent. But I think that being a follower is not always bad, right? Because, if we were to look at the life of Jesus, right, even if you don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, even if you don't believe in Christianity, even if you don't believe any of those things, there's no doubt that Jesus was a real person who lived about 2,000 years ago. And virtually anyone who looks at Jesus' life says that was a life worth admiring. Because how did he live? Right? He lived outside the noise. As noise surrounded him, he didn't let it in. He was his own person. No one told him what he was going to do. He did what he thought was right. But what did he do most of all? He cared for people. What he did is he gave of himself to care for people. And he demonstrated a life that was possible. And through that life, what did he do? He consistently, one of the most consistent things he did was invite people to follow him. To follow him. In other words, do what you see me do and live the way you see me live my life. And so when we talk about being a follower, we want to follow that example. And I think that as we do that, if we were really do our best to look at the life of Jesus and decide to actually live consistent with that life, then I think it will change our lives. Andy Stanley makes this quote, which I absolutely love, that following Jesus will make your life better, and following Jesus will make you better at life. Whether you believe in him or not, is it an example of how to live a life that really matters? And the thing that's kind of really cool about kind of the aspect of following Jesus is that, so often if someone was to say, I want you to live like I live or act like I act, what they would do is they would give you a list of rules. Do this, do this, do this, do this, and you'll be all set. 7-point plan for how to live a better life. Jesus didn't do that. He actually did the opposite. Jesus gave just one rule. The rule was, love others as I have loved you. In other words, the acceptance and the compassion and the going out of his way to touch people's lives. Just do that. So, when we look at the life of Jesus, what we really see in the life of Jesus is a life of love, right? A life lived centered on love, loving people. But the thing that's so important to remember is that although he lived a life of love, it was love with a purpose, right? In the sense that he actually had a very distinct purpose, and he told us what it was over and over again. He lived a life of love to draw people to the Father, to see in him what God was like. That by the time we'd gotten to the first century, the religious leadership had painted such an incredibly heavy, dark picture of God that was just waiting for you to fail, hoping you failed almost, it seemed. And Jesus said, that's not what he's like. Look at me. As Jesus said, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. In other words, that love, that compassion, that acceptance, that's what God is like. And throughout Jesus' life, by having this life centered on love, but directed love, he had a life that actually focused on helping people. But the thing that's kind of funny, if you look at the life of Jesus, if Jesus is God, if you were a Christian and you believe that Jesus is God, he could have fixed everything, right? He could have fixed everything. Every problem that existed in the first century, he could have fixed. But he didn't. It was part of a larger plan. But you know what he did do? Is that he traveled from place to place, and he would visit different people. He would visit different neighborhoods. And wherever he went, whenever he encountered a need, he met that need. So he went from person to person, and when a person had a need, he met that need. And so today, as we kick off the series, in part one here, I want to talk about the people in your neighborhood. What does it mean to take care of the people in your neighborhood? Now, as we look at today, we're going to look at an account from the author named Luke. Now, Luke is kind of an interesting author. He has a gospel named after him, right? The Gospel of Luke. But it's important to remember that when Luke wrote the document that we call the Gospel of Luke, Luke wasn't writing the Bible. There wouldn't be a Bible for another 300 plus years. What Luke was doing was trying to document the life of Jesus. That Luke tells us that late in the first century, there were all these people trying to say what Jesus did do and what he didn't do. And so Luke, being a doctor, tells us that I am setting out to write an orderly account. Luke never met Jesus, but he did know people who had known Jesus. He knew Peter, he knew Jesus' brothers James, he knew the Apostle Paul. And so he investigated and he documents for us the life of Jesus. And so today what I want to look at is one of the accounts he documents for us where Jesus and one of the religious leaders have an encounter, have a conversation. So what Luke tells us is, one day an expert in religious law, stood up to test Jesus. Now, if you know anything about the Gospels, religious leaders were always trying to test Jesus. And how did it go for the religious leaders? They pretty much always lose that argument, right? Today's no different. Right? So he sets out to test Jesus, but I don't think his ideas are entirely nefarious. I think he just wants to know what Jesus knows. So he tries to test him by asking this question. Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? Now remember that in the first century, this person would have grown up under what we call the Old Testament, what they call the law and the prophets. And under the Old Testament, what eternity isn't really very clear. They know that God will have a kingdom someday, an eternal kingdom. So he's kind of asking, well, what do I have to do to be part of that kingdom? And so when he does that, when he asks Jesus that question, how does Jesus most commonly answer questions? If you ask him a question, you know what he usually does? Ask you a question. And he does the same thing here. Jesus turns to him and says, hey, you're an expert in religious law. In fact, technically he's a lawyer, right? Because they lived under Mosaic law, so he's a lawyer for Mosaic law. Right? You're a lawyer, you know the law. What do you read when you read the law? Says the man answered, you must love the Lord God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now that's actually a fantastic answer. Because what he's saying is that, yes, the law is very complicated and there are lots of pieces to it, but it really comes down to two things, right? Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And he's actually quoting pieces of the Old Testament. The part about love God actually comes from Deuteronomy. The part about love your neighbor as yourself comes from the book of Leviticus, and those are core books in the law. And he's also summing up the 10 Commandments, because the first 4 commandments are about love for God. The other 6 are about love for others. So that is a really good answer. So Jesus says, right, you got it. You have tremendous knowledge on what the law says. But after Jesus says that, he makes a point that's really easy to miss. He says, yes, you have the knowledge. Now, do this, and you will live. In other words, Jesus is saying that knowledge is great. It is awesome that you have knowledge. But there's a lot more to it than just having knowledge. It's not just about what you know. It's not even about what you feel. It's not even entirely about what you believe. It's more than that. What really matters is what you do. That love is an action word. So Jesus is saying that in order to be part of that eternal kingdom, yes, you should know these things, but then you should also go and do things. Take action that demonstrates love. Now, we all know that, right? We know we're called to do that sort of thing. Can any of us do that all the time? That time that person cuts you off in traffic? Or my favorite in the summertime is when the traffic's really bad and there's the guy who goes around the shoulder and passes you on the shoulder and cuts right in front of you. Or the person, it's summertime, you're trying to get to your family and you had to pick up a couple things at the grocery store, so you get in the 10 items or less lane, and the person with 40 items is in front of you. Right? Or how about people in the other political party? Or the people who are so outspoken about issues you so tremendously disagree with? Are we always loving towards those people? Or do we get angry? Do we get judgmental? Do we talk about them? All those things hurt people, right? All those things are inconsistent with being loving. And please understand, I'm not pointing the finger that way, right? I'm pointing the finger this way, right? I do those things. We get frustrated. We do those things. We all struggle. And the lawyer knew that. The lawyer knew he didn't do that for everyone. He wasn't always good to everyone. He knows he doesn't always get it right. But being a lawyer, he tries to shift the case. He tries to move things around a little bit so that he can meet the standard. Says that The lawyer wanted to justify his actions. So he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? In other words, when you say neighbor, what are you talking about exactly? I mean, it's not that really wide scope of everyone, right? There's only certain people who are really my neighbor. People who look like me, people who act like me, people who think like me, people who believe like me. The people who will first be nice to me, right? That's my neighbor, right? It can't be all those other people, right? I'm not expected to consider these commenters who are surrounding our conversation to be my neighbor. I can't consider people who believe differently than I do to be my neighbor. People who live a different lifestyle than me, they're not my neighbor, right? Or people who are far away that I'll never see, right? Those people aren't my neighbor. That's not what you're talking about. So basically, he is asking a question. Who is my neighbor? Jesus is going to provide an answer. But again, Jesus rarely answers questions directly. Now, he could give a point-by-point description of what it means to be a neighbor. But in this case, he tells a parable. And this is likely, if you've been in church for any length of time, a parable you know really well. Luke tells us that Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. Now, for first century listeners, people living in the area of Jerusalem and throughout that region, the setup that Jesus provides here would instantly create a sense of fear. Because the road that Jesus is describing, that this man is on, is a 17-mile long road that runs through the mountains, over hills, curves back and forth, has tons of boulders and outcroppings around it. Lots of places for bandits to hide. And bandits were a huge problem outside the cities. Because remember that although Israel is under the control of Rome, and no one was going to challenge a Roman centurion, the centurions focused on the metropolitan areas. They weren't really concerned about the rural areas. So for all the people in that region in the first century, they would know this person is completely alone in this situation. And then as Jesus continues, the bandits stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, left him half dead beside the road. So Jesus' listeners would have known what this meant for the guy. In that kind of condition, right? He's been humiliated, he's had his clothes stolen, all of his stuff stolen, and he's beat almost to death. This man cannot help himself. That unless someone steps into this situation, this man will die, right? No one can call 911, right? Emergency services are not on the way. So someone needs to be willing to get dirty, step into this situation, and deal with it. But as Jesus continues, at first it seems like there's a little bit of hope. Jesus continues and says, by chance a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. Now, a priest, one of the highest ranking religious leaders, do you think he knew the law? He knows it says to love God. He knows it says to love my neighbor as myself. But what did he do? Not only did he not help him, he actually made it a point to not get too close. Right? Walk to the other side of the street. And I'm sure he justified his behavior. I mean, I can't touch that guy. He might have a disease, or he might die. And remember that in that religious system, in order to participate in religious activities, you had to be what was called ceremonially clean. And if you touched a person with certain diseases, you would become unclean. If you were handling a person who was dead, you became unclean. And for a period of time, the priest would not have been able to participate in his religious practices. So I'm sure he could have used that to justify his behavior, but what does that tell us? That he valued his religious practices above human compassion. Right? He put his life, his religion, ahead of caring for someone. But as Jesus continues, another person approaches. And it says a temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there. And in that moment, there is hope, right? In that moment, the man isn't just being ignored. Because think about what it was like for the man laying on the ground. He's injured, he's hurt, he's helpless, he is probably coming in and out of consciousness. And one of the times when he opens his eyes, he sees someone there, a temple assistant. Surely he will help me. But instead, the temple assistant passed by on the other side. What's going on there? I mean, he again would have known love God and love your neighbor, but he didn't do anything. Now, he did stop. Why did he stop? Was he just curious? Is it like the rubbernecking thing when you're on the highway? There's a bad accident and you just kind of have to look at it? Or maybe he was assessing the situation. Well, if the guy's not too hurt, I'll help him out. But it turns out that whatever the reason is, he decided he was not going to help him. So both the priest and the temple assistant, both people who would have known the law very well, would have had incredible knowledge of the law. Those people did nothing. Those people did not appear to see the man as a neighbor. Or if they did, they saw their religious responsibilities as more important than the person. So in failing to help, they were acting contrary to love. But the thing that's important to remember that although they were acting contrary to love, what the priest and the temple assistant did would have been totally consistent with what the listeners around would have expected. Because they knew that the religious leadership was far more concerned with power, right? Was far more concerned with status, was far more concerned with their personal pursuits than actually loving and caring for others. So this story is going kind of just the way that they might expect. But for the lawyer probably doesn't like the story quite so much. Right? He likely feels challenged. He likely feels insulted. I mean, hopefully he's motivated to maybe I need to change a little bit, but he doesn't like where this story is going. Because Jesus was calling out the religious people for focusing on their traditions over actively caring for people. He was calling them out for not taking action that resulted in changed lives. And then as Jesus continues the story, he brings in a twist that no one would have seen coming. Jesus says, then a despised Samaritan came along. And you could almost hear the boos and the hisses from the crowd. Samaritan. Because as you may recall, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the relationship between first century Jews and Samaritans. Remember that the Jews looked down on the Samaritans. They considered them ethnically impure. They considered them religiously corrupt. And Samaritans were a much smaller population. So Jews looked down on Samaritans significantly. But this despised Samaritan, when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. And the imagery here is so important, right? Is that as the Samaritan walks up and he sees what happens, he feels that thing we all feel when we see someone really in need, that thing that rises up inside of us. But where the priest and the temple assistant quickly pushed that back down, Samaritan didn't do that. He actually let it break his heart. And he actually decided that he could not carry on as usual, that he needed to take action. And so the Samaritan then did that. He did what the religious leaders wouldn't do. It says, going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged him. So what did he do? He took care of the man. He ignored their differences and he took action. And the thing that's really important to remember is that given the hostile relationship between first century Jews and Samaritans, the Samaritan would have known that had he been the person laying on the ground right now, the very man he was helping would have been very unlikely to stop and help him. But he didn't let that reality stop him from doing what he needed to do. So as it continues, then he put the man on his donkey, took him to an inn where he took care of him. Now keep in mind, this is a very long road, 17 miles. Nobody goes out for a casual walk on that road. Right? The Samaritan, like everyone on that road, had some place he had to be. He had things he had to do. But unlike the others that passed by, the importance of caring for this man was more important than any inconvenience that the Samaritan would face. He saw a need that he could meet, and he was willing to meet it. He invested his time in helping this man. He invested his abilities in helping this man. And then he went one step further. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you next time I'm here." So after investing his time and his abilities, what did he do after that? He invested his resources. When the situation reached the point, and the Samaritan knew that this man would need ongoing help that the Samaritan could not continue to directly provide, he used his resources to provide additional help, to provide ongoing aid. Again, he saw a need he could meet, and he took action to meet it. Now remember how this story started, why Jesus started telling the story. Remember the question that the lawyer asked. Who is my neighbor? And how does Jesus always answer a question? With another question. So this whole story was a setup to get to this question. Jesus asked, "Now which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits?" Now keep in mind, the first 2 people had a great deal in common with the man who were injured, the priest and the temple assistant. In fact, they might have even lived in the same neighborhood for all we know. The third person, the Samaritan, had very little in common. They were at cultural said that they were at odds with one another. They certainly did not live in the same neighborhood. But Jesus asked, which one is his neighbor? And so the lawyer replies, the one who showed him mercy. Now the next thing Jesus says is the game changer. If you've heard nothing else I've said, if the lawnmower has distracted you, if the tech being broken has bothered you, put that stuff behind for a second. The next thing I say is the most important thing I will say this morning. The one who helped him is the one who is his neighbor. Jesus says, yes, now go and do the same. In other words, move past knowledge to action. That Jesus says that action is what matters. What we do matters. That we can be really tempted to get all spun up over fights and arguments about what we believe. We can get all spun up over what we feel. And those things are important. They're not unimportant. But what is most important, what changes everything, what changes lives, what changes the world around us, what changes our neighborhood, what changes our world, is what we do. That's what makes the difference. And if we are following the example of Jesus, what we are called to do is take action that demonstrates love for our neighbor. Because loving our neighbor does make our neighborhood a better place. And it gives us a better life. That's the thing that's counterintuitive, is that it seems like pursuing personal gain, pursuing power, pursuing wealth. As someone once said, it seems like chasing stacks of green paper with dead presidents should make you happy. That's money, just in case you missed it. It doesn't. It does for a time. But in the end, it doesn't. There's a richness of life. There is a fullness of life that comes about when we are willing to invest in other people, to care for other people. And what Jesus calls us to do is to invest our time, our ability, and our resources in our neighbors. And when we do that, we find our life by reaching beyond our life. So again, if it's about investing in our neighbors, who is our neighbors? Well, according to Jesus, our neighbor is everyone. Anyone with a need that we can meet. In fact, according to Jesus, it seems that the whole world is our neighbor. But can any of us fix the whole world? Can every one of us, can any of us solve the problems that everyone has? And neither did Jesus. Not saying he couldn't, but he didn't. Not at this point anyway. If you're a Christian, we believe that through his death and resurrection he did. But in terms of his ministry, he didn't. He looked at a need that he encountered, and if he could meet it, he'd meet it. So we can't help everyone. So what should we do? Help someone. Right? There's someone that you can help. There's someone that I can help. I mean, that idea is honestly the reason that we've launched the drive to raise money and goods to send to the Ukraine. Right? Because they are like the man in the story. They are a group of innocent people who have been crushed by a bandit, by a tyrant. Right? 10 million Ukrainians have been displaced. 10 million Ukrainians are no longer in their neighborhood. Untold thousands of civilian Ukrainians are dead, with their daily lives destroyed, with no way to help themselves. So this is our opportunity to be a neighbor to them. And Jesus is abundantly clear. What makes a difference is what we do. So for each of us, let's choose to do for someone. Whether it's the Ukraine, whether it's a local charity that touches your heart, whether it's a person in your life that has a need that you can meet, let's each choose to do. Let's each choose to embrace the people we encounter as our neighbor, even those neighbors that are thousands of miles away, or who are literally next door, or in our family, or in our town. I got to believe that every one of us are aware of a person's life or a situation that breaks our heart. And maybe you can't fix it all, but is there something you can do? So let's just do what Jesus shows us. Let's see the need that's in front of us, and let's choose to take action, because that's what changes things.